Today I sit down with clinical psychologist, author, and Professor Marc Schulz to discuss important findings from the longest-running study ever conducted on happiness, the Harvard study of adult development.
What makes it unique is the length of the study, the focus on flourishing, and this idea that we started with, that it was really interested, beginning in the 1930s, in getting inside the heads of the participants. And the signal we found is really clear. It's relationships lead to.
In this episode, you will learn what makes the Harvard study of adult development unique, what the most important findings from the study are, and how we can use this information to live a happier and healthier life. Hopefully that sounds good. Please enjoy. You're a clinical psychologist and a scientist. Perhaps you could kick us off here by sharing a little bit about, I guess, your path into this field of science and healthcare, and then when your involvement in the Harvard study of adult development started.
Sure. So for me, it was not a direct path to where I am today, as it is for most people. I think that sort of twisted path in life is common. I was a kid who was really curious about other people, but also on the shyer end. I was a kind of introverted kid. So I always liked reading about people and reading history and observing people. And I started to do that when I was in university by studying sociology and political theory and political science. And over time became more interested in psychology, but it really took a while. It took some maturing on my part, I think, to do that more directly. Eventually decided, after trying out a few experiences, that I wanted to go to graduate school in clinical psychology. I thought of going to medical school, which was also a possibility for me, and was the best decision I ever made. I met my wife when I was in graduate school, but I also found a field that really fit me and allowed me to pursue my curiosity about people. And it also allowed me to do research and thinking about them. I had kind of alternated between jobs that had direct contact with people and jobs that required me to step back and think and write. And I couldn't find the happy medium. And it turned out that clinical psychology was exactly that happy medium. So I spent some time learning how to work with people who are having challenges in life, and also studying the kinds of factors that led to people having difficulties, but also flourishing. And that was the path that I took following graduate school, is studying people in longitudinal studies across time as they navigated through life, from adolescence into adulthood, during the transition to parenthood, and eventually with this Harvard study of adult development, which I began working with about 20 years ago. And that's a remarkable study that's followed people throughout their entire lives. So it was the sort of granddaddy of all the studies that I had done. Along the way, I became a professor. I've been at Bryn Mawr College for 27 years. Previous to that, I'd worked in Boston doing postdocs, and that's how I got involved in some of the longitudinal studies at Harvard. So that sort of brings me to where I am today, which is a day job as a professor. I do some clinical work as well, and I've trained people over the years to do clinical work, and I help to run that Harvard study.
Do you find that blend between, I guess, academia and then clinical work is kind of mutually beneficial? That the research helps you treat and work with the individual, but then also working with individuals helps inform the research that you're doing?
Absolutely. So the clinical work for me, when I first started it, was really challenging. It's work that's different than just teaching or communicating information. It really involves being present and listening and tolerating difficult experiences. So I grew in important ways. This was in my 20s. I grew in important ways by doing it. And I think it also afforded me the opportunity to learn both how to be with people and how to learn about them, but also how people experience life. So it got me outside of my own head, outside of the readings that I was doing, and gave me a kind of live opportunity to really understand what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. And I've been incredibly grateful for that experience. It also gave me skills in, as I said, getting to know people that have carried over to my research. So the kind of research that I've always done is not kind of distant research where you're just giving people questionnaires or observing them from afar. It's been more intimate research in which I interview people. I observe them very closely, talking about difficult subjects. So the kind of research I've done has definitely been informed by the clinical work and the clinical skills that I have. And in turn, the research and the literature that I read for the research has helped me be a better clinician as well.
Is that type of research that you're referring to there a little more qualitative than quantitative, and that kind of gets me thinking, and I don't want to digress too far and go off topic, but when I think about the nutrition literature, for example, a lot of it is quantitative, and there seems to be an absence of qualitative data, which to me, given the kind of low adherence to certain dietary patterns that we see in the real world, it seems like it's a kind of big missing piece of the puzzle.
I think this is actually a really interesting question to me, and it's a really complicated question. The word qualitative often in the science world has a pejorative connotation to it. It means that we're not applying these rigorous quantitative methods. So the distinction I want to make is between a research approach that really gets in close and tries to capture people's experience and their whole experience, not just one variable or two that person might be able to be quantified on, but their whole experience, a kind of profile of them as a person. And that's a more holistic approach. That's the key part. And it's intimate, as I say. It really depends on getting to know that person. But you can do that in a very rigorous scientific manner, right? So we're studying, in the Harvard study, we're studying over 724 families, individuals from those families, 3 generations we've been looking at. So we're looking at thousands of people in this very intensive close-up way that people, I think, often think about as qualitative, but we're doing it in a systematic way that allows us to draw scientific conclusions. So I think that the only thing I want to say is qualitative often for people is a bad word in science. It means that you're not applying sort of rigorous analysis. You're not measuring multiple variables, but it doesn't have to be that kind of work. It just means looking at people in close and careful ways. And also, as I think you're suggesting, recognizing that all people are the same. So recognizing some of those individual differences as well.
So just to kind of double click on that a little bit more, what we're talking about here is, rather than typically, measuring an outcomes like cholesterol, where you can get a concentration and sort of correlate that with heart disease. What we're talking about here is measuring, when you say qualitative, more subjective things.
It can be measuring more subjective things like how happy people are or their style of interacting with others, but there are ways of quantifying even subjective things like that can be very rigorous. And in fact, that's the challenge that's animated most of my research career. So I'm really interested in emotions. I'm interested in what happens in close relationships. In the past in psychology, we've been afraid to venture into those areas. They were kind of off limits because they were hard to quantify. They were subjective, as you said. So I think the challenge is how do you get at them in a way that's systematic, unbiased, and can be done reliably, meaning that we can replicate the measurement. Someone else would find the same measurement if I was measuring happiness. So that's the challenge in this work, and it's different than measuring cholesterol levels. It's also really exciting, right? It means that you have to be creative and thoughtful about how to do that. Yeah.
And how does that work, I guess, when you're comparing individuals? So let's go back to this cholesterol example, right? We know what the normal reference ranges are for cholesterol, and we can work out if this is someone kind of within that, below that, or above that, and we can compare between individuals who might be at higher risk of. If we take something like happiness, a happiness score, how do we know if someone's 7 out of 10 happiness is the same as the next person's 7 out of 10 happiness? Does that make sense, or did I ask that in a pretty convoluted way?
No, it's a really great question. And I want to suggest that once you venture out of the realm of physical markers, so some of our research has these kinds of physical markers. We've collected cholesterol data, for example. But if you venture out of the realm of physical markers into people's subjective experience, happiness is one of them, their attitudes is another one. The challenges are different than measuring cholesterol. Cholesterol is not without its challenges, right? You have to fast, and different levels of fasting might result in different outcomes. But in the world of these subjective measures in psychology, there are more challenges. And the one that you're identifying is a key one. How do we know that your response, Simon, is the same to my response on a 10-point scale? And the answer is we only know that from repeated research that tries to look at people's responses and how they might connect or correlate to other kinds of markers of the same thing. So we might ask each of us how happy we are. We might then ask 10 of our friends how happy we are. We might then observe that person over a long period of time. And what we're going to find is that measure of happiness has a certain level of reliability, that we can rely on it to a certain extent. And it's particularly true for some kinds of people, maybe not others. And it's also possible, and this is really interesting, that there might be cultural differences, right? It may not just be personal differences. There could be systematic cultural differences in how we respond. So if you look at the world happiness data, here's, I think, an interesting example. If you look at the world happiness data, Scandinavian countries are almost always near the top of that. Finland often finishes first. We'll know soon whether Finland is again number one in 2024. And East Asian countries, for example, are more towards the middle of the pack. And one possibility is that folks in East Asian countries, when they approach scales that are on a 1 to 10 level, they might avoid some of the extremes. They're less likely to want to stand out. So there may be a cultural push to go more towards the middle. And that would bias our assumptions about how happy a country like Japan might be in comparison to any country in Scandinavia, Finland, Norway. So we need to be thoughtful about understanding these measures. Again, for me, these challenges are fun. For other people, they're mind, kind of crushing in the sense that they're not as objective as some of the measures we might have in other parts of science.
Yeah, that's a fun challenge, really, just thinking about how do you adapt the tool to a specific culture or population so that it isn't kind of subject to that bias that you're talking about there. Harvard study of adult development. What is this if someone is hearing that for the first time, and what is it that kind of makes this study very unique?
Yeah. So it's unique in a few ways. I mean, it's really a remarkable study. It started in the 1930s. So it started in 1938, an unusual time to start a study like the one I'm about to describe. This was the eve of World War II. It was also in the United States the end of the Depression. We were still experiencing the effects of the Depression. And two separate studies began at that time that were focused on human flourishing. So instead of looking at problems and outcomes of disease, they were interested in trying to understand factors that may lead to human thriving. One study, it's 724 participants in total. One study was about 2/3 of the participants was started in inner city Boston. This was with a group of adolescent boys that came from the poorest neighborhoods of Boston. Most of them were children of immigrants. They lived in tenement buildings, most without running water or toilet facilities. So these were poor kids facing real challenges in life, marginalized because of their poverty, but also because they were immigrant kids as well. The remaining 1/3 of the sample, which really initially was a different study, was a group of students at Harvard University, so across the other end of Boston. And these were kids that were perched in a very different place in their life. They had great prospects moving forward. They had already made it into Harvard. These were students that were seen as likely to graduate. Both of those groups, the interest was to try and understand in their circumstances what leads to success and flourishing. So both of those groups were followed very intensively throughout their entire lives, from early adolescence, late adolescence, into adulthood, in fact, to the end of their lives. Along the way, their partners became part of the study, and we're now studying 1,300, more than 1,300 of their children, who we call the second generation. What makes it unique is the length of the study, the focus on flourishing, and this idea that we started with, that it was really interested, beginning in the 1930s, in getting inside the heads of the participants, trying to understand what they were worried about, what motivated them, what excited them, how they navigated relationships with their parents, with their friends, how they formed romantic relationships. And they did this through intensive interviews, observations in the homes of all of these participants. You can imagine going to 724 homes, the kind of commitment that they made, and then following people very carefully throughout their lifetime. Questionnaires every 2 years, interviews on the order of 8 to 10 years, medical records obtained every 5 years, observations of key relationships and key interactions over time, more recently collecting brain data, bringing them into the lab, looking at them when they're under stress, seeing how their bodies react to that, getting blood assays so that we can look at markers of inflammation and cholesterol levels and other things that we can gather through blood. So this is a study in which people have been poked and prodded for 85 years very carefully and closely. And that's another marker of what makes this very unique, that kind of close study of folks.
And as just science in general has progressed? Have those things that you've measured, be it through questionnaires or lab-based tests, have they kind of been adapted and upgraded, or are you measuring the same things back from 1938?
Yeah, so yes, of course, the measures have adapted and changed over time. So the domains are similar. The study started with an interest in trying to understand how people flourish. So they looked at their relationships, they looked at their emotions, they looked at the things that they worried about, how they adapted to challenges. And those domains are the same, but we've fine-tuned our measures as the science has come in, and we've learned a lot in 85 years. And there are also measures that were important at the beginning that to our modern eyes were silly. So they measured how ticklish the men were, or these boys were in the late 30s. And we can't figure out exactly why they studied that or what use that might have. They were also really interested in ideas that are outdated at this point. So body types, there was a fascination. This is the eve of World War II. There was an interest in fascism in the United States as well. So there was an idea that certain body types, particularly Nordic or Northern European body types, were the most advantageous, that they might shape your personality. So they took very careful measurements of people's bodies and their cranium size, their head size, because they were interested in these ideas that body shape, morphology, might shape personality and your success in life. So those are outdated ideas, and we don't continue to make those kinds of measurements. We make different kinds of measurements today.
So the tickliest folks weren't living the longest.
We don't think so. There's no clear correlation between ticklishness and those things. I mean, I love giggling. I'm a giggler myself, and I'm pretty ticklish. I have two boys that were pretty ticklish as they were growing up, but there's no evidence that promotes greater connection or benefits in terms of how long you live.
Yeah, I'm in that bucket as well. But maybe they were hypothesizing that it had something to do with neural sensitivity or something, but who knows?
I think that was sort of the route that they were going. And they also collected, very early, somewhat crude EEG data. So they were looking at electrical signals in the brain. It's an incredible repository of data, some of which is very useful today, some of which is not as useful as we've learned more. Science has progressed. But we've really learned a lot about what we've studied. That's the good news. Science has progressed to the point where we know something about what shapes happiness and also determines how long we live. In the 1930s, we knew a lot less.
In the title of your book, it says the longest scientific study of happiness ever conducted. Was it a happiness study from the outset, or has it just kind of become that over time as the results have become apparent, clear?
It was a study of thriving is really what it was, right? And in the 1930s, this is part of that cultural challenge, right? The discourse on happiness was different. Happiness wasn't the primary driver of your life in the 1930s. It was finding meaning and purpose, providing for your family, living according to the rules and the cultural edicts of society was perhaps more important than it is today. So this notion of happiness is really a modern notion of happiness, but I think it does translate to the goals of the folks who started this study, which was to understand how people flourish. In the inner city Boston context, in very challenging circumstances, with few benefits or privileges that are going to help you get ahead in life, and real challenges. And on the other side, from the perch of students at Harvard, with incredible opportunities in front of you and being told already that you're quite special and have a future that's quite promising. But in both camps, there was an interest in what leads to success. So I don't think they thought about it particularly as happiness, Simon, but the study has come to be known as a study of well-being and happiness.
When you use the word flourish or flourishing or success, how might someone at an individual level refer to their life if they are flourishing? What are the kind of things they might say about the life they're living or have lived?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that, but first I want to say is we don't just take people's word for it. So someone might say, my life is great, I'm really happy, but they don't look so happy. And when we look carefully at their relationships and we talk to other people in their life, it's not clear that they really are flourishing. But when we ask people about how their life is, the markers that we're looking for as signs of success or flourishing are contentment. So life is satisfying, general. generally. They have a sense of purpose and meaning. Those are two really critical perceptions. And then we also collect data. For example, we follow people carefully over 8 days, each night, asking them about their day and the emotions that they experience. And we're looking for people who are experiencing generally more positive than negative emotions. So our interest is in part of the signs of flourishing are that we're experiencing happiness and joy more often than we're experiencing sadness and anger or irritation. So emotions, a sense that life is meaningful, and a sense that it's satisfying overall. I would add another piece, and this is really the product of our careful research that's emphasized the importance of relationships. Your ability to engage in relationships in ways that bring the kinds of benefits that we know relationships bring to people, that those are present. So you have close relationships that are nourishing, you feel supported, you have a sense of trust with other people. That's also another sign of flourishing out in the world. Now, you notice what I left out. You're going to ask me, you left out some things. I didn't talk about job success. I didn't talk about how much money people earn. Certainly, there are people that have been very successful in this sample. There's one person that's famously been outed from this study was John F. Kennedy, was part of the Harvard sample. He was relatively successful from a job standpoint. He became president of the United States. But we're interested not in what they do so much as how they experience life and how they connect with others in their lives. And it's not important how much money they earn. We can talk more about their earnings, but the critical markers for us are more psychological. They're more inside people and in the ways that they connect to others.
How did you manage, or how have you managed to keep people in the study for this long, for decades?
Yeah, so this is a testament. I've only been involved in 20 years, and on a good day, I say to myself, well, that's about almost a quarter of the time of the study. But this study has been going on for 85 years, and it's really a testament to the remarkable work of the original people working on the study and the people who have maintained it over these years. So I think, in the beginning, we like to talk about the fact that when we went to the Harvard students and said, we'd like you to be part of a study, they thought that makes complete sense. I'm special. Of course, people would want to know about me. When we went into the inner city boys' homes, their parents said, why would you be interested in my son? He's an ordinary kid. We're immigrants to this country. Why would you ever be interested in us? Both groups across time began to feel valued by the study, so they were interviewed carefully. They met the same people year after year. The study sent them birthday cards, would check in on them if there was a family challenge that they were having. And I think over time, the study became an important proxy family for many of these folks, that it was a place where they could talk about their biggest challenges, they could share some of their biggest achievements or fears. And it was also a time, the 1930s and 40s was a time where folks, particularly men, didn't have a lot of opportunities to talk about their experiences. So the regular check-ins, I think, became a way in which people could reflect on their lives and also share their experiences with people that they had learned to trust across time. So over the course of this study, remarkable percentage of people stayed involved. 84% of the original sample stayed involved across the study. When we went to the children of the original participants, the middle-aged children of those participants, over 2/3 of them said yes. They said, we've been waiting to be part of the study that our parents have been a part of. So there's a tremendous devotion to the study and identification with the study. And I think we've also been careful stewards of that data. So we promised them anonymity. We haven't talked about who's in the study. It was a weird circumstance in which John F. Kennedy began to be known as part of the study. There's only one other person that's been talked about, and he talked about himself being part of the study, another famous person. Everyone else is anonymous. We never talk about identifying information that would link to specific people in the study. So we've been careful, I think, custodians of the trust that people have given us. Really an incredible gift they've given to science by being part of this study. And in turn, we've treated them with what we think is appropriate respect and appreciation as well.
So I want to make sure we come back to, I think, an interesting thing to think about is whether the predictors of happiness and longevity are the same across generations. People that are growing up, you mentioned it at the beginning, I think the initial cohort, this was on the eve of World War II, the Great Depression happening. You said every reason not to be happy. There's also this interesting mix of the successful, young kids at Harvard University with their whole life ahead of them versus the kids that are marginalized because of poverty and lower socioeconomic status. So teasing out what are the predictors, I think, of happiness and longevity for different people is super interesting here. Broadly speaking, you've kind of mentioned relationships, but how do you kind of summarize what are the most significant or surprising findings that have emerged from this study over the 80 plus years it's been running?
So hundreds and hundreds of scientific studies from this study itself, papers presented from this study. I think we're on 15 books now for the study. There are lots of findings over the years. So my co-author, Bob Waldinger, and I, Bob also helps direct the study. It's the two of us that run it these days. Sat down about 5 years ago and we said, is there a story that we can tell? Because we're interested in trying to bring these findings to a larger audience beyond the academic world. It's a limited group that gets to read academic papers and really take them to heart. So can we figure out whether there is a story, and if so, how do we bring it to a larger group? And that was our idea for how we might write a book. So we sat down with the findings and we looked, is there a signal? And yes, there was a signal. Is that signal only present in our study, which is unique and has some unusual qualities? It began in the 1930s, originally all men. Or is this a signal that we can see across studies, across culture, across time, across gender, and most importantly in other countries? Is this something unique to Boston, or is this something common to other studies? And the signal we found is really clear. It's relationships lead to better health and happiness throughout the lifespan. It's all kinds of relationships, and it's lots of different qualities of relationships, which I hope we can talk about, Simon. But that's the clear signal. It's not that other things aren't important. It's not that a little bit of money may not help you flourish. But it's that relationships in our study were the most robust predictor of both physical and emotional health as people aged. And if we look across studies now, we have the data. When we first started finding this 20 years ago, we were surprised, particularly on the health front. Is this true that, relationships are really affecting our physical health? And now we know from the Surgeon General's report and lots of research across many studies and many different kinds of studies that it's very clear that relationships are connected to physical health and even how long we live. Clearest example is the loneliness research, right? So most of us know that somewhere between 20 and 50% of the adult population in a given week feels some experience of loneliness, people not really caring about who they are or knowing who they are. And loneliness is a risk factor for morbidity, for dying. That's on the same level as smoking 15 cigarettes a week or obesity. So it's a major health risk. That's why the Surgeon General issued an advisory, a health advisory about the crisis in social connection in the United States.
Yeah, I remember reading a quote from Bob Waldinger, and it may have been from his TED Talk, or it might have just come straight out of your book, but it said, loneliness kills. Loneliness is as deadly as alcoholism or smoking.
Yep. And I think the data keeps rolling in. Again, we were surprised and skeptical. Is this a unique finding? Science is about replication. That's what I mean by finding a signal. It's replication across studies that have different participants, different methods. This is part of how we deal with the challenge you were asking me about in the beginning, Simon, when we have measures that aren't as objective as measures in other fields of science. Replication is particularly important here. And it doesn't matter so much how we measure social connection. Across many, many studies and meta-analyses that aggregate these findings, we find this clear connection that social disconnection or social isolation or loneliness is pernicious. It's bad for our health. It's very clear.
What would you say to someone that is perhaps thinking, is it the healthy relationships that is associated or responsible for increased happiness and longevity, or is it the fact that people who have better physical health, have better access to money, have better access to all these other things, end up having healthier relationships?
So I would say two things. One is there's no question that the relationship is likely bidirectional, that there are things about physical health that lead to greater enhancement in relationships, our ability to navigate and see other people and spend time and be attentive and present with them can be affected by health problems. There's no question about that. But there's also no question anymore that the other direction is a causal link, that there are so many ways in which social connections, relationships that we have with other people, assist our body, for example, in navigating stress and reduce our stress levels and the impact it has on our body downstream, inflammatory patterns, the expression of genes, so epigenetic effects, our ability to fight infection. We've been able to establish clear links between quality social interactions, quality relationships, and those kinds of physical markers that we know are connected to the diseases of aging and to premature death. So I would say, yes, of course, there's probably likely to be two directions of influence, and they might be mutually reinforcing. If we're lucky to be in a good relationship, our health may improve. That may in turn help us get the most we can out of our connections to others. So we're fortunate if we're able to situate ourselves in a close web of strong connections. We're really lucky in that way.
Hey friends, are you ready to take your fermented food game and gut health to the next level? Look no further than my digital guide, Plant-Based Ferments. Inside, you'll discover some of my favorite recipes, including my soy labneh and homemade kombucha. Visit theproof.com/ferments for more details. That's theproof.com/ferments. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's get back to the episode. Let's double click on that mechanism, because I think that's really interesting, because this whole idea that these relationships in our life somehow leads to living longer seems a little bit abstruse. But what you're describing is there's a kind of direct physiological mechanism at play here. So if I have quality relationships, people that I can share with, people that perhaps I can be myself around, what you're saying is that there's a direct effect on the inflammatory sort of milieu in my body, the environment that my cells exist in.
That's right. So I'll give you a few examples of this. One really interesting area of research is looking at loneliness. So folks who report high levels of loneliness and epigenetic expression, so the way genes are turned on and off. And there are three systems of genes that are relevant to this story. So folks who are more lonely have genes that are turned lower. They're not as active, that fight infection, both viral infection and bacterial infection. So those are two systems. And then the system that's turned up is the inflammatory gene system. So that we know that at a kind of biological level, the absence of those connections is corrosive in that way. And one of the mechanisms is epigenetic. There are other mechanisms as well. And some of them aren't as sexy, Simon, right? Some of them are directly biological. And those are really exciting. And we're learning more and more about them. I'll give you another example of that in a second. But some of them are more straightforward. Being connected to someone, a good friend or a partner, makes it more likely you see the doctor. It makes it more likely you exercise. It makes it more likely you eat well. So there are behavioral effects that also flow from close relationships, and there are effects in many other domains. We figure out who we are. You talked about being yourself. Part of being in a relationship is exploring your own identity, figuring out who you are, and, affecting that identity in a way that is useful for you. So being yourself, pursuing the things that are most important to you. Friends and other people we're connected to help us navigate stress. So when I'm stressed out, turning to a friend to deal with some of those emotions, to try and figure out a path forward. A good friend or my partner, my wife, might say to me, Mark, you're just not thinking about this the right way. You're missing a whole piece of this. So they might help straighten or clarify what's really in front of me. So it turns out when you start to think about relationships, they just do so many things for you. Can I tell one story, Simon? I said there's some less sexy ways, but I also want to talk about how exciting this work is. So I'm going to give you two examples of the research that just give us an idea of how exciting the domain is here. One is a study that was done by James Cone, a psychologist, and he exposed people to pain at the same time he was collecting data on activity in the brain. And he did it under two conditions. He did it alone in a scanner, and he did it holding the hand of another. And in one twist on that, he did it holding the hand of someone you love. It turns out that when you're exposed to pain and you're holding the hand of another, particularly the hand of someone you love, the areas of the brain in which we perceive pain, in which pain registers in the brain, are less active when we're holding the hands of another. So that's one juicy clue, that the experience of connection to others, even someone we don't know, right? It can be a stranger you're holding that hand, but more so if it's someone that we care about, can be powerful. The second example is a study I just love. It's a study where they intentionally gave people wounds. So they did a punch biopsy on people's inner arm here, their forearm. So they took a little piece of skin off, and it was systematically the same across everyone. And they watched how long it took to heal. So they took pictures every day. On average, I think it took about 5 weeks for that wound to heal. People who were in tension-filled relationships as opposed to satisfying and low-tension relationships, it took 7 to 10 days longer for that wound to heal. People who were caretakers of folks with dementia or other major problems that they were helping to take care of, the wounds took longer to heal. So that's an example that I love, because metaphorically we're talking about how our experiences in the world, and particularly how relationships can get under our skin and affect our health. That's one that affects how our skin heals across time.
That first study you mentioned, kind of, I guess, on face value, makes sense. If you don't have support, then the kind of alarm for pain needs to be higher, right? Whereas in that second scenario where someone's holding their hand, the body is kind of registering that, okay, this person has support. I don't need to ring the alarm as loud.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's one mechanism. And there's a way in which we know touch and physical connection between people. It doesn't have to be an intimate relationship. It could be friends. But that sense of intimacy and connection that is physical calms our body down. So our stress hormones get reduced, our experience of pain is transformed in magical ways. So this is a kind of study in a book. Our book, The Good Life, really celebrates the multiple ways in which relationships can literally get under our skin and affect our health. And I think we're learning more and more about that every day. Like the next 10 years, so exciting to be a scientist in this area of research, to really begin to understand those mechanisms. When I was in graduate school 35 years ago, this was sort of fantasy land. We took courses about, are there pathways here that could connect psychological experiences with immunological responses, with wound healing, for example. And there was speculation about it. It was considered kind of wooey and weird. But over the last 30 years, this is real science now, and it's only accelerating. So I think it's a really exciting area to study.
How does the kind of magnitude of effect between relationship quality and happiness longevity compare to some of those other things we've mentioned, like income or career satisfaction or cholesterol? Like what's the difference here that we're talking about?
So I'll answer it two ways. In our study, we looked at midlife predictors of folks that were flourishing in late life, in their 80s, 70s, and 80s. And we were interested in both psychological and physical flourishing. And close relationships were a better predictor than cholesterol levels of things, including physical outcomes in our study. So really importantly here, we want to just sort of pull back a little bit and recognize that there are lots of health disparities that are tied to income. And in our study, this is true as well. So the inner city boys who grew up to be men, and those Harvard students that grew up and eventually we followed them through their lifetime, eventually died, the Harvard men lived on average close to 10 years longer than those inner city men did. So that's a huge difference in longevity. And we see that reflected in other population studies, particularly in the United States, where there are real income disparities. And those are tied to health disparities, the incidence of many diseases and the likelihood of dying. So I would say those are the most powerful factors, right, in predicting premature death. They're very important, particularly in the states where there are these inequities in healthcare and other connections between socioeconomic factors that lead to, more exposure to toxins when you're growing up and things like that. We're studying this, by the way, so we have neighborhood data on those inner city kids, and that's one of the active areas is going back and looking at when the lead smelter shut down or when they had pipes that were lead pipes as opposed to other kinds of pipes to see what kind of exposure to lead the kids may have had growing up. So, of course, there are other factors that are important. In the U.S., socioeconomic factors are really important. Education is another factor that's tied to longevity. But if we look at things that we commonly assume, physical factors like obesity and smoking that we talked about before, it's very clear that relationships are on the same order of magnitude as those. In many cases, social disconnection is a greater risk factor than some of those other things like obesity or sedentary lifestyles. Then that we know something about their risk. So these are serious, and that's why the Surgeon General, I think, issued this public health advisory. These are not common, these advisories. This is a serious public health problem, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. Japan, England have talked about it a lot and elected cabinet level officials to try and address this as well.
Okay, I want to come back to that. I want to think about public policy and perhaps how this research could inform policy. Are you familiar with Jennifer Boylan's work?
Mm-hmm.
There was
a little bit
a paper that I read, the health and retirement study, and I think it's in a similar kind of realm, I guess, similar field. She was looking at 20,000 plus people for decades, and if I recall correctly, I think that the folks in that study who had more life satisfaction and were more optimistic, they were more positive, they lived for sort of 5 or more years on average. Is that something that you also see in your study? So I know that you said that the folks from Harvard were living longer than the kids that came out of the marginalized areas, or they were marginalized because of poverty. Are you seeing in general people that have these better relationships are living longer for a certain number of years?
Yes. So in work that we have that's ongoing, we are looking at the quality of people's connections with their intimate partners. So we're looking at marital satisfaction across 60, 70-year periods. And what we're finding there is that both the average quality of that marital satisfaction, but also the shape of that marital satisfaction trajectory across time predicts when people die. So I'll give you one example. In our data, we see something that's like a U-shaped curve of marital satisfaction. This is the data that we're working with right now. And that U-shape has its nadir, its low point, around the time that folks have their youngest child is about to leave the nest. So it's around the time that their last child is about to turn 18. The depth of the nadir and the bump, there's a little bump that everyone gets after their last child turns 18. So we call it the empty nest bump. It varies across couples. Some couples get a big bump in satisfaction. It improves at that point and then continues to go up through the rest of their lifetime. And some couples don't get much of a bump at all. The size of that bump and the depth of that nadir, the lowest point, predicts when our participants died. So that's an example of a long-term prediction by studying the importance of their connections. We can also see that in other studies. In our book, we talk about a study that was published in the 90s that had a huge effect on me. It was a study that looked at morbidity risk in a number of different countries. It was 5 different studies, multiple samples within those studies. And 2 of the studies looked at folks in eastern Finland, in rural Finland, and in rural Georgia. This was an area outside Savannah. And it was clear if you grew up in eastern Finland, you were more likely to live a long life. Folks in Finland live longer than folks in the United States. If you grew up in Georgia, you lived less. If you grew up black in Georgia, you lived less than white folks in Georgia. So there were important differences based on demographic factors and where you came from. If you looked at the effect of social connection across all those studies, people who were more socially connected lived longer. So the curve or the line capturing that relationship between social connection and the risk for dying, it was an inverse, a negative relationship, was very similar across these 5 studies, which is unusual to see. So that suggests to us that in spite of all these inequities that we have, or the difference between growing up in Finland or Georgia, or growing up as a Black person in most of the United States versus a white person, despite those disparities, there's an enhancement that all folks can get from the presence of being connected to others. Those social networks matter in all circumstances. So that's another way of answering your question. Of course, there are other factors that matter, like money, like education. All these things about optimism are relevant as well from the health and retirement study. But it's also clear across many, many studies that connection to others is a robust and important factor predicting longevity.
Can you explain that first study again a little bit more for me so I understand that? So the nadir, the kind of drop, and then that bump.
Yeah.
What was that, social connection, or was that happiness?
This was reports of how satisfied they were in their primary attachment to their partners, right? So this was marital satisfaction. And we're the only study they know of that can map it across 70 years. So this is unusual data. There's always this folklore that there's a kind of U-shaped curve that we get married, our marital satisfaction starts to go down. Evidence is accumulating that that's true. And it often is thought to go down until kids are ready to leave the nest. And our data shows exactly that is what we see. But the exciting part is the part I think you're trying to get at, Simon, is the depth. So how far it goes down in those first 15, 20, 25 years of marriage, depending on how many kids you have, predicts how long you live. And the little bump that seems to be present that we call an empty nest effect in these data seems to also be associated with a boost in longevity as well. So I want to make this more kind of real for folks. If I have kids that have left the nest, my boys are young adults. The question is whether you're able to lean in and reconnect with your partner with that newly available time that you might have, or whether you suddenly realize that we don't really have anything in common other than we're parents to kids that we spent a lot of time with. People experience very different times when their children are out of the house. For folks who are able to lean in, to reconnect, to cultivate that relationship at that time, these data suggest that there's a payoff in how long that you live.
And so with that nadir, so the deeper that is, the more, I guess, disconnection, the shorter that the shorter the life those people ended up leading. What do you think explains, and this is a big question, the difference between a couple that has a very small, lower nadir versus someone who has a much deeper nadir and experiences a lot more social disconnection? And I'm probably asking you to draw not only on the research, but your clinical experience here.
Well, I could draw my clinical experience, but there's also lots of relevant research that we've done, but lots of other folks have done. So we know that there are lots of things about couple relationships that are physically, that enhance your physical health. So I talked about some of them are behavioral. So if I don't make that doctor's appointment, my wife is going to say to me, Mark, have you made that doctor's appointment yet? That was really important. Have you followed up and made that appointment? And some people experience that as nagging, but I know my wife is worried about me and I know she cares about me. So I'm more likely to make that appointment and go to the doctor. I'm more likely to exercise, to try and be careful about what I eat. So there are all sorts of behavioral things that we often benefit from when we're in close connection with others. It doesn't have to be a primary and attached, an intimate relationship. It could be a close friend. It could even be a colleague at work who you're close with, who kind of you have that connection with. So there are behavioral things that are really important. If I'm stressed out in my life, if I'm having a challenge at work or I'm not sleeping well, my partner may help soothe me, deal with some of the emotions that I have, and that's going to calm my body down and have benefits to me long term. That may have to do with stress hormones and inflammatory patterns and my ability to fight disease. And then I think there are just so many other things that in connection with others, we learn about opportunities that are exciting for us. We experience joy. So think about the moments of greatest joy that you have in your life. If you're in a good relationship, it's often with those people, and it may be with your partner if you're fortunate enough. Those are those moments of incredible joy and happiness, and that's really good for our bodies as well. So I think there are a lot of mechanisms that relate to why good marriages, as indicated by marital satisfaction, and a lack of dip during a challenging time normatively for many couples, why that may be associated with health benefits.
Do we know the kind of characteristics that people have who have higher marital satisfaction? Is there personality traits? Is there different coping mechanisms? Is there some explanation for, I guess, psychological differences between people, or things that people could think about such that they can hopefully experience less disconnection through that period of their life?
Yeah, so that's another, not an easy question, a complicated one, but one that we've thought a lot about. And the answer is yes to all of your ideas about what might be related. And there are other important things. So I would say couples that flourish, that have satisfying, trusting relationships in which both people feel nurtured and connected and able to grow, are a few things. One is that ability to form trust, that we need to be able to be vulnerable with someone else, to share important aspects of our life. That's what intimacy is about, is sharing internal experiences with others that often include things that make us feel vulnerable. So this is an example. I'm, thinking about when I might retire in the future. That's not an easy conversation for anyone to think about. Being able to have that conversation with someone I trust and who I know has my well-being at heart, that's an incredible benefit. And good marriages allow folks to experience that trust. Navigating differences is a critical piece of that. So it's an incredible thing when we're in a relationship with someone else, particularly a marriage. We evolve over time. I'm not the same person I was when I was in my 20s, and that's a good thing. I've changed and I've grown. My wife has also changed and grown. So for some people, they get frustrated. You're not the same person, that I married. You've changed. Well, of course we change, and we often change for the better. But sometimes we also experience challenges. So the ability to navigate that evolution of each of our own characters and our personalities and what's important to us, and in fact, to do it in a way that enhances our ability to grow and maybe to seek new opportunities. So maybe I want to do something different in my work life. If my wife, my partner is encouraging of that, that gives me the opportunity to do that with the security that comes with knowing someone has my back as well. So those are critical pieces of relationships, navigating emotions when we have conflict, because differences are inevitable for all relationships, including our closest relationships. And I think being able to help each other navigate challenges outside of the marriage. Those are some of the key ingredients, I think, for success in marriage.
And some of this it's not easy, and it might not be something that we've been taught. So I can speak from my experience, for example, something I'm really grateful that I've done in my current relationship with my partner that I didn't do previously. And I appreciate this is an enormously privileged kind of position I'm in, right? We actually engaged a therapist just proactively. There was nothing wrong. It was from the outset. And the primary purpose of this was just to get more tools to be able to communicate better with each other. We realized that communication is really everything, and we may not have been taught a lot of these important tools to be able to have these conversations, to be able to be more vulnerable and have more intimacy. So how does someone kind of navigate that? Because if they're hearing you and all of that makes sense, but they just don't have the tools to kind of get there to get that type of get to that type of partnership, where do they start?
Yeah, so I think you're really touching on something that's just so important. So in our book, we talk about the idea of social fitness. So social fitness is a metaphor, And it's an idea that we often think about our connections as things that happen. We kind of take them for granted that they're going to work. People in marriages often find out that they don't have skills that can be useful, and they seek help through therapy or through their marital education classes that provide some of those skills as well. Or maybe they have a friend who's been through this, and that friend can mentor them through some of those challenges. But the basic idea is that if we put our relationships on autopilot, if we don't sort of make them an active part of our decision making to prioritize them, they can wither. We need to cultivate those relationships. So we asked folks in our study when they were in their late 70s and early 80s if they had any regrets. And we were curious to see what kinds of regrets came up. The most common regret by far was that something about relationships. I should have spent more time with the people I cared about was the most common version of this. I should have been kinder to my people I worked with, to my partner, to my husband, to my children. I wish I had been more forgiving in some of my relationships. So when people have the benefit of 80 years of experience in life, they often look back and wish that they had learned things or done things differently when it comes to relationships. We all have that opportunity. So it's not just about marriage, it's about all of our relationships. If we don't attend to them, if we don't cultivate them, they tend to wither over time. So what does that mean? We want to think about who are the important people in our life. We want to think about how much time we're spending with them and what the quality of that experience is like when we're with them. Are there ways to maximize our time with those folks that we experience as uplifting and energizing and are important sources of support for us? And that means regular times to get together. So my colleague that I wrote the book with, who's also a good friend, Bob Waldinger, and I, we talk every week. It's been recently on Fridays. We talk the last several years, and we've been doing that for 30 years together. We have a commitment to each other. So there's some weeks where I talk to Bob more about important stuff in my life than I might talk to my wife about if I've had a particularly busy week. So we have a date that we don't break. It happens each week. For other people, it could be a walking engagement with a good friend. It could be a coffee date that they have with people or a regular lunch date that they have. But we need to invest that time. And when we're with that people, we need to be able to be present. So we need to be able to put the distractions in the modern world, those phones that we carry around, we need to be able to put them away and really be interested in the other person. So you and I, Simon, are looking at each other. We're doing this over the length of this conversation. You know, I'm enjoying the conversation. Part of it is being present and reading each other's cues and being interested in what the other person is saying. It's such a gift when we do that to someone else. And when we receive it, boy, does that feel good. But it's very hard to do that for people these days. So those are some of the skills of really making the commitment. And then there are relationships that aren't working as well that we need to think about. Are there ways to fix them? Is that person willing to work with me? Are there skills that I could, acquire through some assistance, therapy, education, classes, reading books? Are there things that I can acquire that will help me navigate with this person? And then there's some relationships that have always been kind of difficult, maybe even abusive for longer periods of time that we may need to think more clearly about getting out of, that they may be important relationships to eliminate from our life. Those are very hard and very personal decisions, but taking stock and being proactive, it promotes our social fitness is the key idea.
Okay, so social fitness, a degree of intentionality is required. Just thinking about my circle of friends and family, and I may have this completely wrong. It seems like some people are just naturally better at this. Are they being more intentional, or did they grow up in an environment where the modeling was different, the relationships in their household look different, or is there, personality traits, or what explains this kind of difference that I feel between certain individuals who are really good at just keeping their relationships healthy and others that let their relationships drift and slide?
So a few thoughts. And the first thing I want to say is there are very few people really in life that can go through all of their relationships magically without any challenges. So the person who appears very at ease in a group, for example, the jovial person in your friendship group who's always bringing people together and the life of the party, you may not know as much about what their experience is like, for example, with their intimate partner. There may be challenges there that are more hidden, that are difficult for people. So, of course, personality is part of the factor. Some of us are introverted. We thrive best when we're with one or two people in a more intimate setting. We also need time, perhaps, to relax and chill after that, to kind of recover. And some folks are really extroverted. They thrive in a crowd where there's lots of activity and energy. So we need to recognize that. But relationships are critical for everyone. That's the key idea. It's not that introverted people don't need relationships. They just may need a different kind of relationship and less energy, less noise. There are skills we can learn, though, as well. So, in the States, there's a big discussion about, in addition to the 3 R's, reading, arithmetic, and what's the third R? I've forgotten what it is. That we need attention to these kinds of social skills. So listening to people, being attentive, right? There are many people concerned about young people's attention span. We joked even before we went on, we made a brief joke about TikTok and the length of videos on TikTok compared to this kind of long form podcast, that people's attention spans are being trained to be very short. I teach for a living, right? I've been teaching for over 30 years, and it's gotten harder to teach longer classes where I'm trying to sustain the attention of, 18 to 23-year-olds. It's gotten harder to do that. So there are skills that we can learn, and some of those skills, again, are being present, being attentive, being interested in emotion, learning how to communicate my needs to other people. Those are things that you can start to learn in kindergarten and in grade school, and you can continue to develop. As you said, some people find in adulthood that there are skills that they need that they never got anywhere. Some folks are clever about it, or some organizations. So there's some churches, for example, that will do premarital counseling, or even after you get married, counseling that's intended to enrich marriages. Those have been around for a long time. And there's secular programs as well. So you don't just need to find it in a therapist, although a couples therapist is a great place to find it. And a lot of people are working on these skills in their own therapy, right? Trying to figure out how to navigate close connections, how to tell people that are important in their life that they wish they could see them more than they do. That kind of being vulnerable thing is hard, especially for people that have a history of being burned in some way, being hurt when they're in close relationships. It's hard.
Is there any data on whether extroverts or introverts in general create better quality relationships? If I was going to guess, I would guess that extroverts are better at creating more relationships, quantity, but the question of who's better at creating quality relationships, I'm not sure I'd be able to answer.
I think it's a good guess because I'm not sure there's a clear set of findings about the quality of relationships. If we think about the things that we need to get from relationships, which is a sense of connection, an opportunity to share important aspects of ourselves, that probably introverted folks may go about it in a different way than more extroverted folks. But I think they may achieve that quality of connection at a similar level, that it's not about the quality, it's more about the number of people you connect with and the number of people you can keep in your network. So extroverts in some ways have more work to do when they have a larger circle of friends to keep those connections alive and to cultivate those relationships. That's a lot of work it takes to cultivate a large network. And introverts look at that and they say, oh my goodness, I don't have that energy. It's hard enough for me to, mount the energy to sustain, a connection with one or two people in my network. So I think the quality of the experience differs in the sense that it feels different in that relationship for an introvert than an extrovert. But when we talk about the quality in terms of the important things that we get out of connections to others, being known, being seen, being heard, getting the kinds of support, I think across personality types, there are ways to achieve those outcomes.
You mentioned earlier that that nest period, or the end of the empty nest, I should say, where sometimes a couple or a married partner realize that they don't have a lot in common, and divorce rates are pretty high. Have you been able to kind of tease out, is there a relationship between divorce, social connection, and happiness? And does that differ between people who get divorced and never repartner versus someone who gets divorced and finds a new romantic partner?
So we actually studied this a little bit recently in our data, looking across, again, the 80 years of people's experience at how large their social connections were, or especially how large their kind of emotional support connections. So the people in your network that you really depend on for emotional support. And it declines across time. As we get older, we tend to trim that network. We rely on fewer people more heavily as we get older. But it's also clear around key transitions. So retiring is a key transition in people's lives when our social network really changes. For many people, it's a real challenge to go from kind of play group friends at work to not having that group of friends that you used to spend a lot of time with and connect with, to being separate from that. So we need to nurture our connections outside of work during that transition in particular, and lean into maybe making new connections if we want to thrive. Marriage and divorce is another period where things change. Having a child is relevant to this discussion as well. So when folks have a first child, especially, their social network tends to narrow. They tend to connect more often with folks that are having similar experiences, and old friends grow. You encounter them, or experiences with them to grow less frequent. So divorce is a similar thing. It depends partly on who's doing the social organizing in a couple, but that social network gets up it gets mixed up in a new way that you have to sort of reconnect, figure out who's friends or whom. So one outcome of divorce is people often feel quite isolated afterwards. Those couple friends, you have to negotiate who's really going to get those friends. Sometimes you can share them, sometimes you can't. So that's a period of heightened risk, I think, for people. Again, I think this metaphor of social fitness is important. During periods of transition, it's particularly important that we think about our social fitness. Where are we going to get those connections that are important for us to flourish? Are existing connections at risk here? If I move for a new job, if I have a new child, what do I need to do to sustain those relationships? So there's similarities to physical fitness. There are periods of time where we know we need to lean into our physical fitness more to maintain our health. And in the same way, in the world of social fitness, transitions in our life are really critical periods to think about how socially fit we are.
I guess that's also a reminder, if we're thinking about social fitness, to kind of look out for the social fitness of people around us. So if we have a parent, for example, that has gone through a divorce, or perhaps their partner has passed away, and we know that they're isolated, how can either their friends or children encourage or help them build that social fitness back up?
Yeah, I love this. It's just such an important topic, right? So it begins to we said we were going to come back to public policy implications, but these are community implications, right? So if we know that our connections to others are a critical part of our emotional and physical well-being, we need to think about folks that are less fortunate in that way, less privileged, folks that are isolated. So you're talking about older people are often physically isolated. Sometimes they have less mobility in terms of being able to get out and do activities outside of where they're living. Younger people, ironically, are some of the most lonely. So university students report high levels of loneliness, even though they're surrounded by many people with similar interests and a similar period of life. So we need to think hard about people who are socially vulnerable in our world. Again, those younger folks and the older folks are the most at risk for loneliness. And are there things that we can do to enhance their likelihood of connecting in meaningful ways to others? So there are lots of things we can do. If we think about older folks, families can reach out. Connections that older folks are able to establish with grandkids, for example, are so critical. And parents who are, overwhelmed sometimes with all the responsibilities that they have, in the best of worlds, can think about their own parents as resources for helping to socialize their kids, to connect their kids in important ways. And those intergenerational relationships can be just so powerful. They don't need to be just with blood relatives, though. They can be with people from the community. So there are some models that have been very successful in communities of locating senior activity centers next to schools, where the students in those schools can visit the senior center and the seniors can visit the schools. You can develop buddy programs or grandparent-like programs in which people get to learn about experiences that some of the older folks have had. Those are the kinds of enrichment opportunities that are really critical for connecting people. So I think we just need to be more thoughtful about that at community levels. We know that there's been a breakdown in many communities of the kinds of activities that people used to, engage in, parades and community gardens and bowling leagues and things like that. For many decades, there's been a decline in those kinds of activities at the community level. And that's part of what's resulted in these surges in loneliness that we've seen over the last few decades.
Yeah, something that I've found inspiring and has been great to see, and I've experienced being involved in, is pickleball or padel, and it gets me thinking about games and just playing, and obviously the mobility, and physical health needs to be there to permit that. But it's been inspiring to see a lot of people at the age of retirement or afterwards getting involved, and it's competitive, but it seems to be mostly about just connecting with people.
Well, I think I love this example. I'm a racket person, so I've played pickleball. I haven't played padel yet, not quite as popular in the States yet, but it's growing. So we know something about how people make connections and make friendships. It takes repeated contact over time. It's often on the order of 50, 60 hours, sometimes more than that. And it's typically doing something in conjunction with another person, over time beginning to share more intimate aspects of oneself with that person. So recreational activities are great for that. Pickleball in particular is a really interesting sport because the tradition in pickleball is, first of all, you can talk when you're playing in between points, but more importantly, if you lose and you get off the court, you wait for a court to open up, and that's a time to connect with other people. So it's a very social sport, and because you're doing something next to someone else, it's kind of easy to develop some familiarity and hopefully some trust over time. So recreational activities are wonderful. It could be a walking activity. It could be a community gardening club in which you're, contributing to produce that the community can use, but you're coming to a place and being active with other people. It could be a book group. There are lots of ways to do this, but I think we've lost some of the ways that this happened kind of naturally in communities over the years. So we need to be more thoughtful, and community leaders, business people, people in elected office need to be very thoughtful about building this new kind of infrastructure, social infrastructure that connects people. Pickleball, again, is almost a perfectly designed activity in terms of it being active. It also has one other advantage, Simon, right? It is physical, but it's a sport that in some ways can be played by people across ages, even on the same court, which is very unique. Ping pong is like that as well. But pickleball has that ability to unite people across age groups, which is kind of cool.
And your extrovert friends or parents, they might come down or jump at the opportunity to come down when you invite them, but it might take a few more invites to get the introvert down there, I imagine.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I'm about to have my 40th reunion for college. It's 40 years ago I graduated from college. They've asked me to come and talk about my book. I'm excited about doing that. I'm excited about seeing some old friends. And I'm reaching out to friends and saying, you're going to come to our reunion. It's our 40th reunion. This is a big one. You're going to come. No, I hate those crowds, right? It's too intimidating. I'm worried about being with so many people. Maybe we could get together before the reunion on our own. That's a common response that I get. And I understand that totally. I'm on the introverted side, so I get it, what people are worried about. And there's always a sense when we gather socially, particularly when we gather in places we did when we were younger, that there's a kind of fear that we won't fit in, that other people won't like us, that they won't think we're cool. Even as older adults, we still worry about that kind of idea that we're just not interesting enough to other people. So I think that's the challenge. Introverted people probably hear that voice a little more than extroverted people, but we need to get outside of our head. And one way to do that is just be interested in the people that we're meeting. So if I focus my energy instead of on those thoughts in my head about whether I'm being liked or being interesting, and be interested in the person I'm talking to, that's a pretty good way to make those connections and to feel less worried about it too. Yeah. I'm really interested in what you just said. Say more about that. Or, that shirt, so interesting. I'm trying to look, Simon, whether there's a cue I could pick up in the background here, right? That's what we do on Zoom. So being curious about others lets other people know we're interested. And that's what people appreciate.
Yeah, and I think on an individual level, it kind of, at least for me personally, it helps to know that those thoughts of I don't fit in or I'm not good enough are really running through most people's minds. So it's not something that's specifically wrong with you.
Can I tell another one of my geeky stories about research? This is a good fit for what we're talking about. So there were researchers in Chicago. It was Nick Epley and some of his colleagues were studying folks on their commute. So in Chicago, most people take the elevated train to work, but they also did this on buses as well. They caught people at the beginning of their commute. How are you feeling was the first question they asked. And then they said, what do you usually do on your commute? And almost everyone said, I zone out, I listen to podcasts, I sleep. Do you ever talk to people? Oh no, I won't do that. This is in Chicago, friendly city, Chicago. Why don't you talk to people? Well, they wouldn't be interested in me. I'm worrying about intruding on them. They probably want to chill and relax. Psychologists do cruel things. One of the things they do is randomly assign people to conditions. So they said, randomly, I'm going to choose half of you. You have to talk to a person, a stranger, on your commute into the city. The other half, you do exactly what you usually do, zone out. They caught them at the end. They asked them how they're feeling. The people who talked to a stranger reported elevations in their mood. They felt better. They were uplifted. They felt energy that they didn't have. Was it a productive train ride? The people who did the usual thing, it was okay. The people who talked to strangers, it was very productive. So we get this boost that we don't anticipate when we connect with people. It could be the barista who serves our coffee. It could be the person who cuts our hair. But we tend to let our thoughts inside our head get in the way, that we shouldn't approach people who we don't know well. We shouldn't broaden the relationship with the barista because the barista's busy. They won't really care what sports team I'm interested in. When we do it, though, we get a boost. And that boost people experience for days. They'll talk about it with their partners 2 days later. I had this incredible conversation on the train to work this day. There was a person I see on the train all the time, and I finally talked to them. And it was incredible. I learned things about them I never imagined. That's cool. And what keeps us from having those conversations is a fear that's widespread, as you said, that people are going to reject us. They're not going to be interested in us.
Another example that the challenge or the thing that we fear represents the opportunity. I think about micro stress in general in your life. Why are people getting into ice baths all around the world? And a lot of that seems to be what you learn about yourself through exposing yourself to a little bit of stress, becoming more resilient. That carries over into other areas of your life. But this whole idea of, the obstacle is the way, and kind of leaning into that challenge.
I think that's absolutely right. That's part of it. And part of it are these fears, right? We're well-tuned machines. That sort of evolution has had its impact, that we're trained to seek out threats to our existence. But modern life is pretty safe compared to our evolutionary past. So this over-attention to the potential dangers, to the risks, people are going to reject us, often puts us in a place that's not optimal for our health. So another way of saying that is that we don't always know what's best for ourselves. That this is what we call affective forecasting. If you ask me what's going to make me most happy, I might say something that research suggests isn't true. And one of those things is avoiding strangers. People think that, but research suggests that there are benefits of having those conversations.
Right. So the path of least resistance is for me to stay in tonight. I'm going to watch Netflix by myself. I'm going to scroll on my phone versus coming to the event that you've organized and talking to some strangers. Although the second option, which is the path of more resistance, is going to ultimately lead to greater life satisfaction for me in the long run.
I think that's right. That's a clear way to say it. It doesn't mean that every time you make that choice that maybe feels like it's riskier but may have a payoff, it doesn't mean every time it's going to have a payoff. So one time when you talk to a stranger, it may be a weird conversation and you may be happy to get off the train at the end. But more often than not, we can be uplifted by these kinds of exchanges, and we can be uplifted by getting out of our environment, our home, and our phones, and our streaming devices, and connecting with others. So I teach a class on how we quantify happiness, and yesterday we read an article about time use in the United States across the last 20 years. It's quite an alarming set of data. It's collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And if you look at the amount of time people spend with others over the last 20 years, it's plummeted. And they've only looked at in-person connections. They haven't looked at online connections. So that may be part of the explanation. This is particularly true for young people. So I had a bunch of young people in the room. These are college students. I said, this is data that particularly talk about your experiences. You're spending less time with friends, on the order of 2 hours less time spent with friends than people did 20 years ago. I said, should we be worried about that? I've never seen such vociferous nodding in my class. Yes, people should be worried about it. We grew up during the pandemic. We know what it's like to be alone. We know what it's like to depend on our phones and our computers for connections to other people. And we've gotten, I'm paraphrasing, but this was the emphasis, we've gotten lazy. We don't want to get out of our dorm rooms. We don't want to get out of our apartments. We can depend on our phones to connect at some level with people, but it may not be serving us well in the end. So I think, we talk about public health challenges. This is a challenge. The pandemic accelerated this, but this was starting before the pandemic. Devices have made us lazy when it comes to social connections.
The pleasing thing of what you just stated is that they're cognizant of it, but I have to imagine they kind of feel a little bit trapped by the technology and the way society's changed.
All of us are trapped. Yeah, it's not just them. Yeah.
Hey friends, if you'd like to stay connected and reinforce the valuable insights from this show, let's connect on Instagram. You can find me at Simon Hill. That's at Simon Hill. I look forward to seeing you there. All right, let's dive back into the episode. You mentioned that the amount of time we're spending in person with people has dramatically declined over time. That's probably inverse to the amount of time we're spending on screens. Are we, in these younger generations where people have grown up with technology, and as I understand it, their social circles are shrinking, like real in-person interactions are less frequent. Are they tending to be less happy, less satisfied overall with their life compared to 20-year-olds back in the 1950s? Again, people back then were dealing with their own challenges, but has there been a way of kind of comparing how happiness has changed for the average 20-year-old over time?
Yeah, so students, 20-year-olds will tell you this, but the data also says it very clearly. Young people are more anxious, they're more worried about their futures, and they're less happy than people were 20, 30 years ago. It's very clear, the trend. If we look carefully at the sequence of this, it correlates very nicely with the increased use of technology for our connections with others. And some people have drawn attention to that connection. So some of Tweng's work in particular has talked about this generation of young people as being adversely affected by these technologies, even before the pandemic. The challenge here is drawing a causal conclusion, right? Because this is a societal event. It's an uncontrolled experiment. And technologies also have advantages. That's what when I was interrupting you, I wanted to say, I don't want to be all negative about technologies. All technologies carry with them advantages as well as challenges. So during the pandemic, life would have been so much more difficult if we didn't have this incredible ability to connect via video screen to people that we care about. It was incredibly important to survive the pandemic. It is different, though, those connections. We're learning through research. Some of it is ours, some of it is other people. Emotions are dampened when we connect via video-mediated technologies. The kinds of cues that we use are dampened as well. So oftentimes we're in synchrony in a really good conversation with other people. Our entire bodies, not just our faces nodding at each other, but our entire bodies become synchronous. So in these video-mediated connections, we often just see upper torso and face, And I think, frankly, there's something even alerting for us that we're used to, again, detecting foes. If you think about it on a savanna, on a plain, in the distance, we need to see people's whole bodies to see whether they're going to be friend or foe. And on Zoom, we don't have that ability to see people's whole bodies. So we're less comforted because we can't see the full body. And there may even be a kind of nascent threat that people experience. So I think this is an area of active research. I think technologies will overcome some of these challenges. There are ways to make the interaction via video mediation more real, to make it feel more in person. But I think it's going to be hard to make it exactly like the in-person connections. The last finding I left out is that people feel less connected to the person they're talking to when it's any technology, but video-mediated technologies as well. Text, even less so connected than in-person connections. So we need to think about this because we've grown more dependent on technology-mediated connections. All of us, not just young people, but it's especially true for young people.
So what can the young person kind of think about here if they are in that position where they have quite a lot of connections online, but they don't really have many deep, meaningful connections, people in their lives that they can show up authentically around, share deeply with, because at the outset you mentioned that's what's required to get that attenuation of inflammation and stress, and that's really what a quality relationship is. So where does a young person go that wants to develop those relationships?
I think that's a really important question. So I think universities have responsibility. I think school settings, public schools, K through 12th grade in public schools are an important part of the picture. We need to present opportunities for people to develop these skills, to practice these skills. So all of us need to learn how to get along with others, how to make connections, and equally important when we have disagreements. So you might have a best friend that you've been buddies with for the longest time, but I bet you've had disagreements with that person at various points in time. How do you navigate those differences? How do you express anger if you're upset with someone? How do you do that in a way that can be productive? These are skills that we can learn and we need to take responsibility for. I think they become even more important as people have less opportunity to practice them in person. I do again want to say there are some exciting things that technologies allow us to do. So it's great to receive a text from my son, for example, thinking about you, know you had a big event today, hope it went well. That's a great feeling and really an appropriate and healthy use of technology. But that doesn't substitute for having a conversation at some point with my son to find out more about what his experiences have been like over the last week, what he's been excited about, any interesting activities that he's had. Those are hard to do on text completely. And if you do them via video, there's a lessening of some of that emotion and synchrony that's important. Now, my son is in Chicago. I'm on the East Coast, so I can't have those in-person conversations all the time. So I depend on technology for them. So technology has a place, but we need to be aware, particularly as we're developing these skills, of the importance of in-person connections. I'll give you one other example, and I don't want to draw too dire a picture, but I've been in educational settings for almost, 45 years when I include my college days to now. And there's always an awkwardness at the beginning of class when you come in and you're trying to figure out you're going to talk to people that you kind of know but don't know. Class is starting soon. You want to be ready. Students come into class the same way everyone comes into meetings. Their phones are out. They're looking at something. It could be their latest emails. It could be something that are streaming, but it means they're not talking to the people next to them. And it's not just kids in college classes. It's people going to meetings, that informal time before a meeting starts. And at the very end, they're checking their phones right away. For some of us, it's a way to avoid the awkwardness of not knowing whether people are going to talk to us, not figuring out what questions to ask. So people are burying themselves in the technologies in ways that I think is limiting our opportunities to develop these skills. And that's what I worry about.
Yeah, a distraction. Is that with your son? I'm just thinking here on a practical level. Are those video calls something that you schedule in? I know that I often, I forget to call my mom or I forget to do the Zoom call. She also lives in a completely different area to me. How do you kind of keep that going, and are you strategic about that?
I think it's really kind of personality wise, and I have two sons. So one son, we have a regular time. We talk to him. It's a Zoom call, and it's pretty big commitment. We do it, that time. If he's got something or we have something, we adjust it, but it's pretty close to that time. And he likes that predictability. And for us, it's it works fine. We like that predictability as well. The other one would hate that. He would hate having a regular call. Then it becomes an obligation for him. So we have a lot of, maybe tonight's a good night. Doesn't sound like you're too busy. We're around 2. Why don't we set up a call where we can see each other on video, FaceTime or Zoom or something like that. Or, we're out walking. This son, my wife and I will often talk to him when we're out on a walk, and we know when he's walking or exercising. So that's a common period of connection. And he, in particular, has the ability to really focus on the conversation, even if he's walking. So he's very present. He's developed that skill. I'm proud of that in him. But very different, and that's partly reflects their personality. So I don't think there's one size fits all, but the trick is doing it, right? So you got to call your mom, and you just got to figure out how you're going to do it. If it's a regular routine and she's not going to feel like it's becoming an obligation, great. If she's the kind of person that says, you're just calling me, Simon, because it's Sunday at 5 and you feel obligated, then call her at different times, right? That's going to work better for you and her. Yeah.
Right. It can't be contrived or forced.
Right.
I think earlier we mentioned intentionality, but that's not to be confused with just ticking off a box.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you have to be really interested. So you asked me, we started the conversation with my journey, sort of how I got to be someone that researches people's lives and what motivates them. I'm really interested in people. I could have been an anthropologist, would have been really fun for me too. And I just so happens that being interested in people is good for your health. I got lucky on this dimension. It took me a while to figure that out, that it has those kinds of benefits. But if we're really interested, it turns out that people are really interesting. Not just any one person. Everyone has an interesting story to tell if you work hard enough. If you're not finding a person interesting, you're not either listening hard enough or you're not getting them to talk about what's really sort of drives them, what really animates them. So my assumption is everyone is interesting. We're interesting in different ways. And partly I learned that clinically, right? I worked with people really struggling or were really unhappy with their lives. But learning about them was a kind of, it benefited me, it enriched me by learning about their experience. And I carry that over to my personal life. Quite, and on the train, I'm interested in the people around me. It could be the most interesting conversation I've had in a long time. Any moment, I know that that's possible. That's exciting.
Do you have any questions or kind of go-to things that you would say to someone to kind of get them to share something? If someone's thinking, I'm just not sure how to open the conversation.
Yeah, no, this is hard. It's also hard for me, and I've learned this over the ways. And part of it is, smiling, a posture that suggests sort of openness as opposed to threat is really important. So how we do it is important as well. And then maybe most importantly, I'm going to give some examples of how we might open up conversations, but most importantly, it's really being interested in what people say. So there's nothing worse than you told me about racket sports a moment ago in our conversation, right? So if I say, oh yeah, you're a tennis player and a squash player. No, you told me padel and pickleball. Now you may be tennis and squash, but you said specifically pickleball and padel. So I listened and I remember that information. So Simon, pickleball, padel. And that suggests to you that I'm really leaning in, right? I'm curious about what you're telling me that's different than what other people tell me. And the interesting part of that was padel, because padel isn't a big thing in the States, but I'm guessing maybe in Australia it's become a thing. Yeah. So we could talk about that. So we start conversations lightly. We don't start with, Simon, are you married? Have you had an affair? Those aren't good opening questions, right? We start lightly. Something about what people are Wearing shoes are good because it's not central and it's not up at the top where we kind of glaze away. Weather is a good conversation starter. Where are you going if you're on the train? Are you headed to work? Is this for fun? We start lightly, and once we engage, then it gets more, the opportunities open up. But oftentimes being interested in something that's happening in that moment, the weather, the length of the train ride, the fact that it's been taking a long time because there are a lot of stops today, or the announcements are hard to hear. Is it just me or is it you? It's that small talk that we think is silly, but that's a way that we engage someone when we can measure whether they're open to conversation or not. That works across culture, but we have to be gentle. It's a dance there, starting those conversations. With people we know, it's easier. You talk about common experiences that you have. And again, it's a bit of a dance. We don't want to start right away. So we often say to people, how are you doing, right? But in the States, the answer to that is usually good or okay. It's not a very informative question, but that's an interesting question. That's a invitation to intimacy. How are you doing, Simon? Right? And if I'm really interested, it's going to be longer than a one-word question. So we don't really start with the most intimate questions. We start with safe questions. Yeah,
and I think that fear of rejection that you mentioned earlier is a real thing. Particularly approaching a stranger, right? Someone may have done this and received a very cold response. The person that they're trying to engage with is, assuming the position of, what does this person want from me? And maybe that hasn't been such a great encounter. Is there something that you would get people to think about if that's their experience, so they have experienced this fear of rejection quite a bit and they're just not really confident in speaking to a stranger?
Well, I think it's also important. I'm imagining listeners, hearing this and thinking, well, there are some times where we don't want to talk to strangers, right? If we feel physically threatened, and if we're in a place where there are not other people around, if there are gender dynamics that are going on that are scary for someone, we want to be thoughtful about who we talk to and how vulnerable we make ourselves. But assuming that you feel safe, there are all these voices in our head that we need to be dealing with. So, people usually, I'm not very good at this. I'm not a good conversation starter. People don't find me interesting. Usually when I have these conversations, I can't remember the key things, or I say things in ways that are unclear. This is the common voice that everyone has in their head. We know this from studies, and that's part of why people don't talk to strangers. So we need to kind of be brave and recognize that we may make mistakes, but if we indicate a sincere interest in the other person, they're likely to reciprocate most of the time. Not a guarantee, but most of the time they're likely to reciprocate. So some of it is being brave, right? There's very little benefit in relationships without putting yourself out there to a certain extent. That's true even in long-term relationships in which there's been an exchange of great intimacy across years. We still need to put ourselves out there and say, this routine that we've gotten into, it's not working for me in the same way that it did 20 years ago. That's a really hard conversation to have with a partner. We need to be brave to be able to put ourselves out there in ways that feel vulnerable. Again, histories of being burned, of being mistreated in relationships make that much harder. But all of us in adulthood, regardless of our previous experiences, can continue to grow in relationships, continue to grow more brave, to put ourselves out there and to be more resilient. So I might say something to you and you might say something back. And if I think about it one way, I may think, well, maybe you were kind of insulting me in a certain way, or it doesn't sound like you liked what I said, or you're making fun of me or something like that. So I could focus all my attention on the potential threats, or I could say this person doesn't really know me yet. So I probably misinterpreted what they said, actually. Again, I misinterpreted in that negative way. So being brave is part of it. And it's true for all of us, no matter how extroverted, that being in connection with others means putting ourselves out there to a certain extent, opening ourselves up.
Just to be clear, because we're kind of talking about two different things here, which do intersect: the interaction with strangers and then the building and cultivating of quality relationships. So purely the interaction with a stranger, whether that becomes a good friend long term, it is beneficial. is what I'm hearing. And it may lead to a quality relationship being built over time.
What I would say is that it may not. Like most interactions you have with a stranger on a train commuting to work, unlikely to build to a long-lasting relationship. Some might. If it's a person you've seen repeatedly over the years and you finally make a connection, they may become a buddy. And I've heard of celebrations in, train car compartments when people have birthdays with their fellow commuters. So there are those kinds of connections happen. But just the enriching nature of a momentary connection that you have with someone, when you really feel like you've exchanged meaningful things with another person, that person has understood you and been interested in you, even if it's for a circumscribed amount of time, that has benefits in the moment. It's uplifting. I think it benefits our body. It reduces our stress. So it's not that every interaction we have with a stranger is going to lead to a long-term relationship. Most won't. I'm pretty sure of that. But they can still be beneficial. During the pandemic, when the mail person would come and deliver the mail, that was the only person I got to see live for a few months, right? Besides my partner, and my kids were home for part of that as well. That was a big thing to look out the window and wave to that person and have that person wave back. We also celebrated their bravery. They were out there delivering mail despite what we thought were some of the risks at that point. So acknowledging those connections is very human. It gets us outside of ourselves and recognizing that there's a community that's bigger than ourselves. And that's different. You're absolutely right, Simon. It's different than sustained relationships that we have with each other. But that interest in other people's experience is beneficial in both contexts. That's the bridge that I'm making. So if I'm interested in the experience of other people, it's going to suit me well when I'm talking to a stranger on a train, when I'm talking to my barista, a taxi cab driver, an Uber driver, or when I'm talking to my wife, who I know pretty well. But if I'm interested in what happened to her today, what her walk was like with her friend, what they talked about, she's going to be more engaged with me, more interested in engaging with me.
When I was a kid, I remember at school and probably on cartoons, this phrase, stranger danger, which obviously has its place, but it seems that there needs to be this balance or strike this balance between interactions with a stranger being dangerous versus interactions and showing interest in people that you don't know being beneficial to our psychology.
We obviously need to, that's what I mean by weighing the circumstances, and maybe situations as adults I'm talking about where we need to be careful about trying to make a connection with someone that we don't know. It may be a situation in which we're alone with that person, or there may be other dynamics at play that are making us uncomfortable. So of course we need to be thoughtful about the risk. It's really interesting. I've been lucky to travel, and I'm an observer of people. And for some reason, this is what's coming to mind as we're talking about this. I'm on a train in Tokyo, and it's the end of the school day. And kids as young as 4 or 5 come on the subway in Tokyo, which if you've ever been on the subway in Tokyo, it's packed with people. It's not the most comfortable place to be. Even not during rush hour, there are a lot of people on it. The kids come on, they sit in their seat, they're talking to each other, they're adorable. They're carrying their lunch boxes, they have their school uniforms on. That's a strange sight for someone from the United States. Kids commuting at that age don't commute on the public trains. We put them in buses because we think it's safer, away from other people. So different cultures navigate that stranger piece differently, right? And they have a layer of protection that's different than other places. But boy, I love that experience. I started riding the train at that time to see if the kids were going to come on the train because they were so adorable. That was uplifting for me to watch them and their interactions with each other. It's very different. It was novel because it was very different than what I experienced growing up in New York. I grew up in and around New York City, and kids from school that age don't come on the trains, the subways. It's too dangerous for them, is what people think. Yeah. So of course we need to be wary of strangers, but we also need to recognize, for me, in that moment, I didn't talk to those kids. My Japanese skills aren't good enough. I even was careful smiling at them because I didn't want to be intrusive and make them feel uncomfortable. But boy, I enjoyed watching them interact with each other. And I enjoyed watching the subway all look at those kids and appreciate that they were part of that community.
Yeah, that's cool. Do people with healthy relationships late in life, and we were talking before about the importance of young people building real, deep connections. I'm interested, do people that do have these healthy, strong relationships later in life, do they tend to have this sorted in their 20s and 30s? And if they don't, then it's kind of like you reach a point where it's too late?
Yeah. So that's a great question. One I kind of feel pretty passionately about. When you study people over 85 years of their life, one of the clearest things you learn is that people change. So there are two kinds of changes. Some are normative changes that happen developmentally, like, we learn more words as we grow older as a kid. That's a developmental thing that our language improves over time. So one of the things we've learned now from our study and from other studies is that older people do get wiser in a certain way, that they grow emotionally. They learn how to maximize the emotional benefits of relationships. This is normative. So in general, they learn to maximize those benefits. And part of that pruning, their social networks are often smaller. People die, they lose touch with folks. They're more circumscribed in their movements as well, their ability to get around. So their social networks may shrink, but their relationships tend to be more rewarding with those fewer number of people. So normatively, the good news is we tend to learn things as we grow old. We think about that as wisdom. And there is, in fact, we can study that and see that there is wisdom as we grow old. Then there are individual changes. So there are people in our study who were miserable and lonely for most of their adult life. There's someone who we highlight in a later chapter that, in fact, we call It's Never Too Late is the name of the chapter. And this person lived an incredibly lonely existence. He was a watchmaker. He got most of his joy out of working with watches and repairing them. In a marriage that wasn't very satisfying, his wife wasn't very social. They rarely got out of the house and spent time with other people. His work was his main source of satisfaction. In his 60s, his eyesight started to go. It got more difficult to do the work with his hands as well. And he had to retire. He made two very brave decisions at that point. He decided to separate from his wife, who he had been in an unhappy relationship with for almost 40 years. And he decided he was getting old enough, it was time to go to a gym to work on his physical health. He went to a gym the same time every day, and he realized that the same people go to the gym at the same time he goes every day. And over time, repeated encounters with people, he started making connections with people, including people who are interested in old movies, which was his other favorite thing in life. And he started inviting people from the gym, these were younger people, over to his house to watch old movies together. So this was a guy who in his 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, we'd ask the question, do you have friends? He would say very simply, no. In his 70s, after he had spent time at the gym and had grown, do you have friends? With a little bit of a smile, yes, several. So this is an incredible story. And again, it's one of those transition points, right? It was retirement. And for him, it was separating from his wife at the same time. Somewhat serendipitously, because he began to work on his physical health, his social fitness improved. He was there with people every day, engaging, got out of his house, right, as the moral of the story. He was active with other people, and suddenly his friendship network changed. Now, he never had lots and lots of friends, but having several friends for a period of time late in his life, after having no friends at all for 40 or 50 years and feeling quite alone, quite an achievement. So the answer is, yes, we all change in a normative way. Some of those changes are good. All of us learn some wisdom across time, even though we vary in how good we are at connecting with others. But some people take advantage of, particularly of transitions in their life or periods of time when it's not working for them, and they learn and grow in important ways. And it's very clear from our research that that's true. That's in contrast, Simon, to psychology. If you read psychology texts 30, 40 years ago, there was a lot of information about how children change. And there was a suggestion that by age 18, we were kind of set in stone. Our personalities were set. Our brains didn't change very much after that. We know that that's not true. Our brains continue to change. They're plastic throughout our lifetime. And they change in predictable ways and unusual ways when we engage in certain activities. And the same is true for our social connections as well.
I love that story of that man. Very, very heartwarming.
It's incredible. Incredible. Yeah.
Is this relationship that we're talking about between relationships, happiness and longevity, is it the same for men and women?
Yeah. So I think, yes, there's some evidence that at one time in kind of recent history, men were happier than women, and then it became sort of roughly equal. There's some suggestion it's continuing to change. But if there's a difference in happiness that's connected with gender, it's very, very small. They're essentially equivalent. I think the more challenging question is, are there differences in the way men and women navigate social connections? That's a really interesting question. And I would say historically, it was very true that there were some differences in how men and women navigate social connections. So women had more friends. They often had more intimate connections with others. They often organized for couples the social experiences of both members of that couple, so that labor fell unequally towards women. They had more responsibility for it. But it's pretty clear when you look developmentally, if you look at adolescents these days, boys and girls, and you ask them about what they're looking for in friendships, it's remarkably similar. Boys and girls both want friends that are interested in who they are, that will look out for them, that have their back. But really, there's a kind of sense of trust and the ability to share intimate experiences with that other person, meaning important experiences in their own life with that other person. Something seems to happen still in most societies for boys and young men where that becomes mixed up. That sense of intimacy becomes mixed up with masculinity, that somehow being masculine shouldn't be about sharing or that intimacy, and they pull back in certain ways from that. And I think that still goes on, but it's changing at an incredibly rapid pace. Again, I work with young people all the time, and this whole notion of what we mean by gender has changed in important ways, and the expectations for what might be put on masculinity or femininity are changing quite rapidly. So that's a long way of saying objectively, we don't see a lot of differences these days, not as many as we used to see between men and women in their connection with other people, the importance of friendships, the number of friends that we have. That's gotten very small if there are any differences. And it's clear that for both men and women, these connections are important. What may be different is the role that the primary relationship plays. For men, it may be more important to their health than for women. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and there's some research to support this. If your spouse dies, particularly if it's the man is widowed and loses his wife, his risk of dying in the next year is quite high compared to prior to that death. For women, the risk is lower than it is for men. There's some research that suggests that. So the things that men have traditionally gotten out of close relationships, they may benefit them more than in traditional circumstances they benefited women. There are changes that are going on now that I think mean that we need to re-examine that. Partnerships have changed in important ways, but traditionally we saw more benefits for men from their primary relationship than for women.
So when the husband passes away, what you're saying there is the life expectancy of the wife who's still alive actually increases? And what if so?
It doesn't increase. No,
doesn't increase.
No, it's just not as greatly. The risk of dying in that next year is lower for women than it is for men after losing a partner. There's still a heightened risk. So there's still an incredible adjustment and stress, and grief is really hard. But some have interpreted the difference as a sign that men were getting more out of this partnership than the women were getting out of. Women were paying more, if you will, and getting less out of it. I think that partnership is changing in important ways, so we need to continue to study this, but that's been the traditional signs about the different role of relationships for men and women.
That makes more sense than what I said. If someone earlier heard us say that loneliness kills, and they're thinking, I enjoy time by myself, I like solitude. What's the distinction between spending time in solitude, spending time by yourself, and feeling lonely?
So loneliness is not about physical isolation, right? Some people live in places where they're very remote and in rural areas where there may not be another house around for miles. That's physical isolation. Older people tend to be more physically isolated because perhaps they're not able to drive or they're not as mobile as they were when they were younger, so it's harder for them to get together with other people. So that's physical isolation. When we talk about loneliness, we're talking about an internal experience. We're talking about a subjective sense that our relationships and our connections aren't where we'd like them to be. It's kind of like people have used the metaphor of thirst or hunger. It's we want more from our connections with others. And most of what we want is we want to be known by others. We want to know that someone at least has our back and that someone's looking out for us and cares about whether we're doing okay or not. So that's the feeling, the experience, the set of that perception of the world around you. That's what's particularly corrosive and is tied to lots of diseases of aging and premature death. That sense that there's no one out there that really knows us or cares about us, and that we want more somehow. And that's a feeling that, unfortunately, Simon, this is true across developed countries, is common, right? In the United States, depends on the survey, somewhere between 20 and 50% of folks over the age of 18 report experiencing loneliness in a given week. It's a common feeling.
You mentioned earlier there are many different types of good quality relationships. It could be intimate. It could be with your children. It could be with a friend. What about the relationship that we have with ourselves? And I have to imagine, as a clinical psychologist, this is something that you work with people on. Do you have to have a healthy relationship with yourself before you can go out and form healthy relationships with others?
Yeah, people say that a lot, and I think it's partially true and partially false. So let me say why I mean that. None of us are perfect. We're all evolving. We're works in progress, all of us. And even those wise elders that in their 80s and 90s have really figured out how to get the most out of their connections with others, they're works in progress as well. So to wait until you've worked out your relationship with yourself, worked out your stuff, means that you're going to miss out on life, right? Life continues to happen, and life is short. So we need to recognize that we're all flawed in some ways. Even those of us that have the most confidence in ourselves and think that we're the most competent, there are ways that we can grow. So I never want people to get the message that we need to fix ourselves first before we can engage in connections with others, because that's going to be a lonely and difficult life. The other piece that complements what I've just said, which is really important, is that we often grow not just by being by ourselves and figuring stuff out in our house, in our heads, or even with a therapist, right? With a therapist, it's interesting to think about. You're in relationship with someone who's trying to help you. An important part of a therapeutic relationship is the presence of that connection between the client and the therapist. So we flourish and grow and learn things when we're in connection with others. My wife has taught me so many things that I never would have learned if I wasn't in a relationship with her. Part of it is around the differences that we've had, or things that I've had to adjust or think about or re-examine that I assume were true, but were only true because of the world I happened to grow up in or the family that I happened to grow up in. And when I look closely at another person's life through her lens, I recognize that there are other ways of looking at things. So we grow in relationship. So yes, we need to work on the things that make us, that create challenges for us in life. Some of us need to heal from past relationships that have been difficult, but we need to figure out ways to continue to engage with others, because relationships themselves have the capacity to continue to enrich our lives and to help us grow. Now, I haven't said this, but it's very clear from all the questions and the ways we both have talked about it. Relationships, there's no guarantee of health. They're challenging. They're not easy to control. Our partner, whether it's a friend or an intimate relationship, changes and grows and has their own ideas about things. Relationships can be quite challenging as well. So I'm not suggesting that being in a relationship with others is always about ease. It's not always about joy. And in fact, if we think about it, this is the irony of life. This is the sort of, it's not an optimistic view. If we don't connect with others, it's hard to flourish. If we do connect with others, we experience the most intense feeling of all, which is loss and grief, when we have those deep connections with others. So this is the irony or the conundrum of living, that we have to engage in these relationships that make us vulnerable. They leave us feeling the greatest feelings of sadness and loss when we lose people people that we're connected to. But if we don't do that, it's awfully hard to experience the incredible joys and pleasures of life as well.
Kind of forces us to experience the full spectrum of emotions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the, so John Kabat-Zinn, who's popularized Zen or Buddhist ideas really about mindfulness for public audiences. The book that I think was most popular is a book he called Full Catastrophe Living. And that's a line from the movie Zorba the Greek. Zorba the Greek is someone that leans into life fully and experiences all of it. And there's a particular scene where he's on a boat and he's talking to someone who's much more reserved about how you have to lean into the full catastrophe. Kids, marriage, challenges. That's the catastrophe of life, but it's also the beauty of life. That's where that title comes from.
I'll put that into the show notes. Earlier, we just touched on public policy, and we spoke about kind of happiness at the nation level. I read an interesting paper that was talking about how you measure sort of prosperity at a nation level. There's a lot of focus on GDP. Is that misdirected? Is it incomplete? If we really want to look at prosperity in that broad sense of flourishing, what should countries be measuring?
Well, there has been a movement right over the last 20 years, 25 years now of this World Happiness Reports that started originally as Gallup polls. And now there's a whole infrastructure trying to poll, hundreds of countries around the world on a common measure of how satisfying life is. They also try and look at the emotions that people experience. And I think part of the impetus for that is the discussion. We also hear it in discussions about Bhutan. Bhutan is a fairly isolated country that's chosen to emphasize growth that helps encourage a psychological flourishing, what they call gross national happiness, as opposed to only gross national product. So I think there's more and more attention around the world in Western countries and Eastern countries that economic growth by itself has to be considered in the context. It's not okay just to focus on it alone, that we need to think about its implications and how we grow for people's psychological well-being as well. The clearest example, though, is in the way that nations have come together most recently to fight social disconnection. There have been public health calls, not just in the States, they're in Australia, they're in England, they're in the broader UK, they're in Scandinavian countries. So in the UK, which was early on the bandwagon in 2018, they appointed a minister of loneliness to the cabinet. And that's a position that's had a real impact, I think, on discussions and public policy in the UK. So one of my favorite examples comes from efforts in the UK. You also see these in Scandinavia. There are things called chatty benches. And I'm going to use chatty benches. They're real, and I'm going to talk about what they are, but they're also a metaphor. So a chatty bench is at a park. You can imagine a pretty park with a garden and trees where people are gathering. In New York, most of those benches are green. They're just painted green. That's sort of the traditional color, or maybe they're left to be a kind of wood color. In the UK, they make some of those benches a very bright color. It's typically yellow, and there's a sign on them that says chatty bench. And that means that if I find you sitting at a chatty bench, I don't have to worry about whether you're going to find me intrusive if I start a conversation with you. I know that you're sitting there because you want to have a chat. So England has figured out ways to physically bring people together by using these chatty benches. And if we think about chatty benches as a metaphor, it means in senior homes, everyone wearing name tags. So if I happen to forget your name because I'm old and I tend to forget things, which is common as we age, I'll see on the name tag Simon, and I'll say, Simon, good to see you. Or even better name tags, ask me about, it says under that, ask Simon, ask me about Padel. That's what your sign says. Because I know you must have some interest in Padel, right? And maybe I'm overestimating that interest, but it'll start a conversation.
I could tell you a whole story about how I learned to play Padel in Bali, and then that would open up, my experiences in Bali and what took me there.
Which sounds fun, right? To have that conversation. So We need to figure out, and this is at the public policy level, how to establish these chatty benches. And I'm talking metaphorically now. Are there places where we can have people come together that are going to encourage the kinds of connections that we think are affirming for people's soul and are also physically beneficial? So, when we're thinking about planning neighborhoods, do we want to have sidewalks? Are cul-de-sacs really useful because people gather at them? Are there community gathering places like gardens where people can do things together that we want to promote? If we're running an organization, do we want to think about this trade-off that we're making between transaction and time or efficiency, and on the other side, connection? Of course, Zoom meetings are much easier for people. You don't have to dress up. You don't have to commute in. You can get to that next meeting very quickly because you don't have to commute afterwards or move to another building. But you give up that downtime where people often connect and ask about things outside of work or brainstorm about projects that are important at work, right? So I depend on the ideas of others when I do my research and when I interpret that research. Where do we have room for those conversations in all kinds of organizations if all of our structured time is in front of these boxes of screens, right? So I think we need to think hard about this at the policy level. It is a public policy challenge because of the extent to which loneliness is associated with morbidity and all of the diseases of aging. It's a really critical discussion to have. So in the US, I love this language, and it's borrowed from other places, but our Surgeon General, who's the chief health official, has emphasized building social infrastructures that promote connection. They're really critical for our health, is what he's argued.
I'm conscious of your time here, so just before we kind of land this plane, I think we'll have to get you back for a part 2 at some stage. And we've gone 2 hours now, so that's 121-minute TikToks. If we cut this,
your stamina's pretty good, Simon. Yeah.
If we cut this up and make this accessible to the young people, it's quite a lot of content. Looking forward, what are the next steps for the Harvard study of adult development? Where to from here? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we're actively collecting data on those more than 1,300 children of the original participants. They're mostly middle-aged, but they range in ages, and the commonalities are still there. We're still interested in people's emotions and how they handle adversity and their relationships with others. The focus that's quite relevant to the discussion we had today is we're also interested in how they navigate the technology world, particularly the technologies that connect us to others, and how they use social media. This focus is even more important because we're able to look at how people are doing before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So to what extent is kind of the ability to navigate connections, to use social media and technologies well to enhance connections with others? To what extent did that help people adapt to the challenges of the pandemic? These are the kinds of questions that we'll continue to be focused on. So it's a study that's been kept alive partly by incredibly tenacious leaders and creative leaders, a little bit of luck, or maybe a lot of luck across 85 years, which you need to have, and success in getting grant funding, which is so critical for a study of this magnitude. Future's uncertain. We never know. And when they started the study, I think optimistically, they thought this study might last 5 years. So they would be amazed, the folks who started the study, that we're having a conversation about their work and the continued study of the same families 85 years later. It would just astound them.
Marc, thank you so much for today. I've truly learned a lot, and you've inspired me to take action on a few things, one of which is calling my mum today. She'll be up in Melbourne in 3 or 4 hours time. So, and I promise it's not just ticking off the box, Mum.
Well, tell her I said hello, and it's been a pleasure. Really interesting conversation, Simon. So thank you for having me on your show.
And we'll have to chat about Padel at some point.
I love it. Padel looks so cool.
It's a lot of fun. Great workout too. And just the social aspect, the amount of banter and the friendships that I've been able to, existing friendships, build upon and have a lot of fun, and then develop new friendships has been amazing.
Is it a thing in Australia? Is it starting to be a thing? Like here, it's fancy clubs is where you find them. It's hard to find it.
It's a little fancy in Australia. There's a friend of mine has set up a couple of courts. There's private courts. It's not that accessible yet. Whereas in Bali, I think the trends come from Europe. A lot of Europeans living in Bali.
Yeah.
There's now courts everywhere. So it's become a big thing. Yeah.
I play, I don't know whether you know the sport, paddleball. Do you know, have you ever seen paddleball played? Yeah. Okay, so paddleball is a big thing in Pennsylvania. I didn't grow up here, but it's a big thing. And it's an incredible sport because you can play it in the winter at night when it's 20 degrees out. So it helps me get through the winters. It's great fun. And very social in the way we've described. So, yeah.
Maybe one day we can get a game in.
That sounds fun.
Okay.
Thank you much for doing this. It was a pleasure. Sure. Yeah.
Other than getting a copy of your book, The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Study on Happiness, is there anywhere else that you want to send listeners that would like to learn more about your work?
So we have a webpage for our book, thegoodlifebook.com, I think is the website, and people can search for it. I'm on LinkedIn is a good way to see some of my recent activities, and it's easy enough to find me at my academic website at Bryn Mawr College as well. It's been one of the pleasures about writing a book. I didn't anticipate that as the sense of connection I've had with people who have read the book or heard podcasts that I've been on. It's been a kind of life energizing and enriching experience for me. So I love it when people reach out.
Perfect. Well, we really appreciate all of your contribution to science and taking time out of your day today to join us. Thanks again.
Thank you, Simon. Been a pleasure.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.